Welcome, everybody, to the Cactus Networking Project webinar series. My name's Sarah Bullock, and I'm at the Cactus Networking Project based in Sociology at the University of Surrey. With me today is Christina Silva, Director of the Cactus Networking Project. Christina is going to be facilitating the discussion session at the end of our webinar today. This is our 52nd webinar since we started the series in 2020. And we're really proud to have created a space in which researchers from around the world have shared knowledge and experience around computer-assisted qualitative data analysis in a really wide range of contexts. So now on to the matter for today. It's my utter pleasure to welcome Professors Jessica Lester and Trena Paulus to this webinar series today. Jessica Nina Lester is a professor in qualitative methodology in the Qualitative and Quantitative Methodology program in the School of Education at Indiana University, Bloomington. She specializes in qualitative research methodologies and methods, as well as research in critical disability studies, cultural studies, and discourse studies. Trena Paulus is professor at East Tennessee State University, and she specializes in qualitative research technologies, including the development of innovative methodologies for analyzing social media and online learning environments. Trena and Jessica have collaborated for a long time now. A few of their collaborative outputs include the co-authored book, Doing Qualitative Research in a Digital World, which was published by Sage in 2022. And they're also co-authors of the article Qualitative Inquiry in the 2020s, Exploring Methodological Consequences of Digital Workflows, which was published in the Journal of Qualitative Inquiry in 2023, and the article most recently, Digital Qualitative Research Flows, a Reflexivity Framework for Technological Consequences, published in the International Journal of Social Research Methodology in 2024. So they're clearly perfectly placed to share reflections on the topic of GenAI in qualitative workflows, which is what they're going to talk to us about today. Whilst Jessica and Trena are speaking, please do post questions or comments that you have in the chat, and we will collate these, and Christina will facilitate a discussion around these after the talk. So Jessica and Trena, I'm going to leave the floor to you. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. Looking forward to this webinar greatly.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Christina, as well, for the invitation to share today. The focus of our talk is first thinking through some of the consequences of using AI in and for qualitative research, as Sarah pointed to. And when engaging in this critical appraisal, we'll also be inviting an evaluation of AI, but also considering closely the reporting, the use of generative AI within the context of qualitative research workflows. Before jumping into the meat of our presentation today, we're going to share a little bit about our early thinking around technological innovations and qualitative inquiry, and lay the foundation for how we've come to our own current conceptualizations of how to think with and engage with generative AI in this particular historical moment in the field of qualitative inquiry. So to lay the foundation for our discussion, we're just going to briefly reflect on how our longstanding work that Sarah referenced has engaged and worked at the intersections of qualitative research and technology. So more than 15 years ago, we began first reading, writing, collaborating, engaging in qualitative practice around questions of how digital tools were shaping and have always already shaped qualitative inquiry. Our first book in this area was Digital Tools for Qualitative Research. And this really was a book where we approached technology from a more instrumental perspective. I would say it could be fairly characterized as a perspective that we position the researcher as someone who uses digital tools in the service of inquiry. And at that stage, our focus was really largely on considering how technology could enhance qualitative processes, workflows, thinking about how it might shape and support analysis processes, management of data, supporting collaborative efforts within a qualitative research project as well. By the time we wrote our second book, Doing Qualitative Research in a Digital World, our thinking had really evolved quite considerably. In this book, we took up a more critical and reflexive orientation and really centered criticality, and positioned this idea that technologies are never merely tools, and really wrote against some of the instrumentality that we had forwarded in our first book. And in that, we positioned technologies as material agents, entangled with us as qualitative inquirers, entangled with our participants, and the research context within which we worked, and oriented to technological uses in qualitative inquiry as really actively shaping the very processes, as well as the possibilities of qualitative research. So this way of thinking continues to shape how we approach this new moment, so to speak. As some have characterized it within qualitative inquiry, we know more broadly, this particular moment in time is often referred to as the AI Renaissance. But that thinking continues to speak to us, and we're continually asking, what are the consequences of engaging with these technologies? And perhaps more importantly, we're also asking the question of what's left of qualitative inquiry when we do engage with generative AI. So some of the underlying assumptions that we bring to our discussion with you today, as well as the ways that we're thinking about generative AI, really draw upon a set of perspectives from qualitative scholars working at the intersection of qualitative inquiry and technology, each in different ways, of course, and they, in different ways, push back against some of the dominant narratives of technological inevitability as well as technological progress. What underlies these perspectives is a shared set of assumptions that qualitative research, really at its heart, is a practice. It is a craft that's grounded in interpretive understandings, interpretive practices, relational engagements, relational entanglements, and ethical care for the materials as well as the people that might be involved in our inquiry processes. Many of the scholars that have informed our thinking in this moment also remind us often that automation might increase efficiency and speed, but we have to be very thoughtful and critical about the risks that might come along with that, the potential for eroding the very practices that give qualitative inquiry its epistemic and ethical ethos. So we assume and suggest that perhaps technological progress is not something that we are always to simply embrace and assume that we should fold into our work, and that at times it should be opposed, but at a minimum, it should be critically appraised. And we recognize that this critical appraisal might run counter to some of the momentum towards automation of qualitative processes, but we think it's an important slowing down. So as an example, you'll see on this slide, Christina Silver's plenary, which is accessible and viewable, cautions that generative AI in its current form may not align with some of the values that underpin qualitative inquiry. Sam Ladner's provocative points that she raises point to potential epistemic emptiness that can come about when we reduce qualitative research to simply being about description, quantification, or summary. Similarly, Hannah and Bender's assertion that AI is not inevitable, again, really invites us to think carefully about the place that we have in the decision-making process related to our workflows, our research workflows. We choose to engage or not to engage with these tools. And then finally, recently, Javier Monforte published an article in Qualitative Health Research that points to a stance of refusal related to automation and really forwards the notion of craftspersonship as itself a methodological and ethical act. So together, these perspectives certainly shape how we're thinking about the evaluation, the critical appraisal of engaging with Gen AI in qualitative inquiry. And also invite us to really be asking questions about how, why, where, and when we might engage with GenAI, and on whose terms technologies, including GenAI, should enter our work. And in really engaging with those questions, it also invites us to think carefully about what could potentially be lost in these processes, recognizing that none of these processes are neutral, but bring with them some degree of consequences. And when we do this, it's really leaning into this idea, as Fielding and Lee wrote many years ago, actually, reminding the qualitative community that new technologies always already come with strings attached. New digital technologies bring with them a form of shaping our research policies, institutional expectations, and the boundaries around customary norms of what is and is not legitimate in qualitative research. So it's important then, we would suggest, to really think about what are the strengths that come with being at what some might call the cutting edge of qualitative inquiry. What boundaries are currently shifting around what is and is not legitimate in qualitative research. Now, we certainly recognize that AI, GenAI, very well is creating some opportunities for inquirers to engage, for instance, with large data sets and sit at the methodological table, so to speak, of working and analyzing with data that perhaps many qualitative inquirers haven't been engaging with in the past. Some have argued that we're able to think as co-partners, co-thinkers, co-analysts with tools like ChatGPT, that our early inquiry processes can really be supportive. And some have even pointed to this idea that we can become more efficient for searching for patterns, while recognizing, of course, that efficiency isn't necessarily a goal or a commitment for us as inquirers. So indeed, we now recognize that many individuals have begun to imagine what it might look like to code in different ways and categorize our qualitative data. Yet we do wonder, again, what the cost might be for presumably sitting at this cutting edge. What are the unseen and the seen consequences of engaging with GenAI? And so before even jumping into thinking about how do we report our use, an important foundational reflexive practice is really to engage in slowing down our research engagement with GenAI and thinking through potentially what some consequences might be. So part of this is attending to what have already been identified as some of the threats posed by GenAI. So here we want to extend from the question we posed around what are the consequences of engaging with AI and qualitative inquiry, and really think through what are some of the named, understood threats. And it's really important that we name these key threats as we make decisions around what we're adopting, when we're adopting, and why we're adopting and integrating them into our qualitative research workflows. So first, we really can't think about using GenAI without acknowledging the harm to data workers. Often it's been well documented that data workers are often underpaid and invisible laborers who are being tasked with labeling, moderating, and cleaning data that make the AI systems possible for our use. And this form of digital piecework is part of the broader, what some have argued, extractive economy that really undergirds and underlies what is referred to as the AI renaissance or technological progress, that is. And then it's also been well documented and more extensively written about in the last 6 months that there is an enormous environmental cost of AI. Model training, the massive consumption of energy and water raises really important and critical questions about the ways in which our use of GenAI might leave methodological footprints that we hadn't imagined. And so this is an important consideration as well. And then third, there's the issue of intellectual property theft and contested data use. Much of the data used to train Gen models, of course, has been scraped without consent from published research, creative work, and even private communications. And this, of course, raises questions about ownership, consent, and ethics. And those kinds of questions, long before GenAI, had been central to the work that qualitative inquirers engage in. And then fourth, algorithmic bias and injustice remain central concerns related to GenAI. It's well documented that AI systems are trained on data that encode existing social hierarchies, race, gender, disability, ancestry, citizenship, and more. And we know that many of these systems reproduce those hierarchical biases under the guise of really neutrality. And then fifth, consistent errors and hallucinations in generative systems do challenge the very notion of what it means to trust the kinds of data that we might be engaging with. When an output is plausible, but might be false, we must ask what happens to qualitative interpretation, which relies on careful situated reading of meanings. And then finally, we face the rise of undetectable deep fakes. And there's been an increasing amount of writing around this within the qualitative community. For qualitative researchers, we often work with narrative, images, and language-based data, and deepfakes pose really profound methodological and ethical considerations, dilemmas, if you may. And then kind of over all of this, it's important to also recognize that within the qualitative research community and elsewhere, there is the presence of conscientious objectors, those within our communities who choose to refuse or resist engagement with generative AI altogether. And their stance is one, perhaps, at least in part, not of avoidance, I would argue, but of an ethical and often a named epistemic commitment, a refusal to participate for some in systems that might risk undermining their values related to interpretive and, in some cases, justice-oriented foundations within qualitative inquiry. So together, these threats remind us that engaging with AI is never neutral. It will always already impact our research workflow processes. It is a situated ethical choice, one that is to be made with thoughtful and critical appraisal. So with this laying our foundation, it's a fair question for you to be asking now. So how do we, as qualitative inquirers, engage with GenAI in our work? So I'm going to first just talk a little bit about my own engagement with GenAI and then pass it to Trena to share with you around her use of GenAI. So up to this point, much of my engagement with AI has been through reading, writing, and publishing about potential implications of AI to the qualitative inquiry community. Some of this has included efforts in collating some current thinking related to this and a special issue on AI, along with colleagues in qualitative health research, and then an upcoming special issue related to the ways in which the philosophical foundations of qualitative inquiry might be shaped by AI in the International Journal of Social Research Methodology. Across these projects, my focus really has been on posing critical questions about the use of generative AI around how it might shape, reshape, even unsettle or undo some of the core concepts that have long anchored qualitative inquiry. In my own empirical and methodological work, I've made an intentional decision not to integrate AI into my qualitative research workflows, at least for right now. That said, I do make use of AI tools in other areas of my professional life, particularly in administrative and organizational work. As an example, I regularly use Microsoft Copilot to generate initial task lists for projects, or to produce a first pass description of an initiative that I might be working on to support the revising, expanding of some kind of bureaucratic type list. Trena.
Thanks, Jessica. I also just want to make a quick request if all the participants could just double check that you're muted. I'm picking up on quite a bit of background noise, and I know in Zoom it's possible to mute everybody, but I'm not sure we can do that in Teams. So just if people could kind of double check. So in terms of generative AI, my first work has been to really look at the discourse and the language that was quickly taken up by the software companies and other researchers around what AI could offer, which was speed and basically solving the problem of being human and getting rid of the tedium. It really positioned qualitative research as a problem to be solved. So Jessica and I and Charlie Davis published a paper in AI and Society, kind of pushing back on those, that way of framing qualitative research as a problem to be solved by AI. And also Vittorio Moroni and I also published one just looking at how the early days of the software companies, how they framed it as really increasing speed. Because I regularly teach a class on digital tools for qualitative research, I have had to really become much more competent and familiar with the AI tools for qualitative data analysis, especially than I would like to, because students and novice researchers especially quickly took those up because LLMs and ChatGPT and platforms really are strong text analysis tools to some extent. So I've been doing a lot of integrating AI workflows into the class with a chance to kind of have a sense of what they're adding or what they're taking away from the kind of work that we do. And then just being, a co-author on papers with other scholars who are using AI and trying to introduce this idea of technological reflexivity. And like Jessica has said, really try to slow down and have people think about the consequences of the rush to normalize and adopt this platform, but knowing that I can't really step away from it entirely because I do so much collaborative work with other scholars who want to know how we might best be able to use it and how. So those are just a few ways that I've been engaging with it since pretty much 2003.
Thanks, Trena. So in the remaining time that we have in our presentation, our hope is really to pose an invitation to the qualitative research community to both, as Trena said, critically consider, appraise the consequences, both good and bad, of using GenAI for qualitative research, but then also call for some transparency around when, where, why, and how GenAI may be used within a qualitative research workflow. And it's important just to clarify that without a doubt, a lack of transparency around the use of digital tools in qualitative inquiry is really nothing new for our field. In fact, concerns around not disclosing any detail about the ways in which digital tools might be leveraged really predates the emergence of generative AI. So we know that guidelines and consistency and reporting qualitative methods has always been quite uneven. Researchers often go about describing their analytic process only partially, or in ways that is often critiqued for making it sound cleaner, more linear than it actually is. And this has created what some scholars have described and critiqued, this long-standing claim of opacity, the black box of qualitative data analysis. And then second, the same really has held true for the use of qualitative data analysis software, computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software, or Cactus. Despite the decades of qualitative inquirers using Cactus, reporting practices around these tools are often used in really inconsistent and uneven ways. It's pretty rare that we see clear accounts of the ways in which software is being used, the ways in which it would shape the analysis process and interpretation, and really getting at this idea that software, for instance, is entangled with the inquirer. We rarely see that unpacked. So, this inconsistency in reporting really does reinforce what is really a seductive kind of invitation to orient to technology as instrumental, just being a tool. So the idea that digital tools are neutral aids to analysis or interpretation. But as we know, technologies are never neutral. They always have consequences. They structure and shape our practices. They inform and mediate in some way what becomes possible in our interpretation. And even in subtle ways, they can shape the entirety of the inquiry process. So when we're thinking about and turning to the use of generative AI, it's not really that transparency suddenly became an issue within our community. It's that these older issues of the black box and inconsistency in reporting and or orienting to technologies as instrumental, and therefore we really don't need to report them, are really now amplified with the emergence of thinking about Gen AI for qualitative inquiry. And therefore, we would argue are even more important for us to think about how do we report use. So while we've noted that transparency around the use of digital tools has historically been uneven, it is important to acknowledge that we do have some guidance. There has been some literature around what this might look like to report digital tools. Next slide. So Trena and some of her colleagues, as one example, conducted a systematic review of how qualitative researchers went about describing their use of cactus tools, such as Atlas TI and NVivo. And what they found in their analysis was that reporting practices were unsurprisingly, but concerningly inconsistent. They were often vague, overly technical, or they were framed in a way where the software itself was positioned as doing the analysis, doing the analytic work. So in their work, they offered 7 practical recommendations that moved us closer to thinking about how to transparently and reflexively report, in this case, our use of cactus. If we looked at these points, we can see how they really push back against the idea that software is just a neutral background tool. They speak to the importance of identifying the software version, using active rather than passive voice, describing what the software was used for and why, citing training resources, describing the specific features that are used, backing up any claims of improved study quality with really concrete evidence to resist that temptation to assume that somehow technology automatically enhances and inevitably enhances rigor. And then finally, they point to reflecting on the merits and the limitations in considering the software as part of really the research ecology. So taken together, these points model a way of writing about technology that is reflexive rather than instrumental. And they align well with kind of our broader argument today that transparency is not simply about a checkbox, but a form of methodological care and ethical engagement that really does turn in careful ways towards considering the consequences of technological entanglement. So if we hold this in mind, it really does give us a way to think differently about how we might or might not engage with generative AI. Because really the question is not just what can AI do for us as qualitative inquirers, but what kinds of relationships, entanglements, values, epistemic commitments does engaging with Gen AI reconfigure when it enters into our qualitative research workflows? Trena.
Thanks, Jessica. So this really was one of our foundation points in developing this new framework for how to report and assess the use of AI in qualitative research. Understandably, because some of the most powerful AI assist tools have been developed by the Cactus, by the QDA software companies, MaxQDA, NVivo, Atlas TI. And so as we all know, AI-assisted workflows in terms of research workflows, research designs that include technology are already underway. Just a few examples. Olivos and Liu in the journal Field Methods published an article called Opportunities and Cautionary Tales of Utilizing AI for Questionnaire Pre-Testing. So they explored the use of GPT models as a way to pre-test survey questionnaires, working on survey design, and how do you incorporate feedback as an additional stage before human pre-testing, potentially reducing successive iterations. So there's quite a bit of work using AI to generate research documentation, interview protocols, observation protocols, all of those sorts of things. Argyle and colleagues in political analysis wrote the article Out of One, Many, using language models to simulate human samples, in which they propose and explore the possibility that language models can be studied as effective proxies for specific human subpopulations in social science research. And they discuss the development of silicon samples. So AI workflows, what is this going to mean in terms of collecting data and even generating synthetic human data? How will that play a role? Abramson and colleagues have an article coming out in the annual review of sociology called Qualitative Research in an Era of AI, a Pragmatic Approach to Data Analysis, Workflow, and Computation. And this article actually does a nice critical analysis and pushback as they argue for a pragmatic sociological approach that moves beyond dualisms of technological optimism versus rejection to show how computational tools, which are simultaneously dangerous and generative, can be adapted to support longstanding qualitative aims when used carefully. And finally, I co-authored a piece this year with Corey Johnson at North Carolina State University on a writing workflow, academic writing workflow, where he was working alongside ChatGPT to write a book chapter. And we worked together to create a more reflexive process around that in order to kind of talk about what was gained and what was lost. And these are just a handful of many publications that are out there describing how AI-assisted research workflows are being explored by all of us and what that potentially will mean. So I would say that at every AI-focused webinar I've attended, over the past few years, people are constantly asking for how do we report this? How do we talk about this? And there are, more and more out there. The publishers, Sage, Routledge, all of the journal publishers, academic publishers are providing guidelines, often around the role of AI as an author or not an author. That seems to be one of the big points of discussion, who is entitled to authorship. Professional organizations, APA, ASA, increasingly AERA, are increasingly providing guidelines as well that are specific to disciplines. Our institutions, our universities, government agencies, other research institutions are all providing guidelines in terms of how to work alongside AI, how to report AI. There's also some really great library guides, and I think we have this reference at the end of the slides. Weaver in 2024, for example, published a great piece on reporting qualitative research and AI use in the college and research libraries news. But there are really few guidelines specifically for qualitative research scholars. So when Susanna Friese and David Morgan approached Jessica and I about contributing a chapter to their book, we decided that we really wanted to focus on this idea of what might reporting guidelines look like. And so the other thing, so the guidelines for reporting the use of qualitative data analysis software that we published in 2015 was one of the pillars of our AI guidelines. The other pillar is really this reflexivity framework that we published in 2023. And this grew out of our own lack of transparency, as Jessica mentioned, with our first book. We were really called out by Catherine Adams and Terry Lynn Thompson in a very professional and appropriate way in their book where they really said that we did not take seriously the ethical issues when reporting use of digital workflows in the first book that we wrote. They critiqued our own initial instrumental view of technology, and their argument was that we said reflexivity and ethics were important throughout the book, but we did not really illustrate how to do this in any meaningful way. So that pushed our theorization of technology forward, and we tried to do more of that in the 2022 book, as Jessica mentioned. And at the time, we didn't know, we really didn't understand how the consequences of technology would become even more apparent in 2020 during the pandemic. And we're all still living kind of through the consequences of the extent to which technology is mediating all of our interactions. So we're all suffering the consequences of a social media driven and now AI driven world. So while reflexivity is a concept that's widely written about, conceptualized, and known to qualitative methodologists, there's been a lot less work over the years focused on technological choices and their impacts on the inquiry process. And so we were really informed by Whitaker and Atkinson's 2021 work. I should have put a cover of their book up here, but they talk about how reflexivity is too often framed as a virtuous stance used by researchers to signal attainment of a certain level of rigor, rather than as a stance that must be taken, adjusted, and revisited throughout a study. So whether we signal it or not, who we are, where we are, the choices we always make are always impacting research designs and outcomes. And so we define reflexivity and the idea of digital workflows in our 2023 paper as the process of intentionally attending to the perspectives, assumptions, attitudes, and beliefs that shape design decisions and meaning making and world making, including the use of technology, because technological consequences are already a part of engaging in methodological reflexivity and should be highlighted even more. So this is going to look familiar as we move into the specific AI guidelines. This is how we took Whitaker and Atkinson's type of reflexivity and thought about the consequences of adopting digital tools and spaces in 4 ways: how we enact our methods, because anytime we adopt technology, it is going to shift how we do methods. The design of the technologies themselves, as we use and adopt our methods because of the technology, we may actually want to re-engineer those technologies so that they're more useful for us as researchers. It's going to change our human relationships as researchers and participants. And it's going to have consequences for what our findings look like, how knowledge is produced, and what the outcomes are. So those roughly align to these categories that Whitaker and Atkinson proposed in their book on reflexivity. And then in that paper, we provided some guiding questions, which we will also do today for AI, in terms of how might we think through these ideas in a systematic way. And in that paper, we actually used the example of transcription workflows. As we start introducing new technologies to transcribe our recorded data, we use that as the example. And then we have actually already written about the application of this framework for AI in the Cactus Networking Project blog, and I don't think I can share that link because I'm presenting, but we'll share that link with you. That was our kind of early thinking back in March. It's called the AI Dilemma in Qualitative Research: Progress, Pitfalls, and the Price of Innovation. And so the merit framework, guiding responsible innovation and qualitative methods, as I mentioned, we specifically wrote to this for this invited chapter, which is in press with in this particular book that is with SAGE. And now we'll start. We're basically going to work through each of those 5 categories briefly, and then also show some example paragraphs of what this might look like when you write it up in your paper, and then we'll open it for questions. Okay, so Jessica, I'll pass it off to you for methodological adaptation.
Yeah, so as Trena noted, the merit framework is really building off some of that earlier work where we're thinking about technological reflexivity and those categorical consequences. Merit stands for methods, ethics, responsibility, impact, and transparency. And what we argue in writing about this framework is this idea that these 5 categories or dimensions really invite us as qualitative researchers to describe how AI is used, as well as to reflect on what that use does. So the first being methodologically, M being methods, and this perhaps is arguably the most consequential for us to consider when thinking about the ways in which adopting GenAI might shape a qualitative research workflow. So what we're asking here is, if we integrate GenAI into our analytic processes, our research workflow, how do our methods need to be adapted? How are they inevitably adapted, and in what ways? So there's several questions that we offer that we feel can really guide both reflexive practice as well as reporting. So helping us understand what and why we should be reporting about our use of GenAI. So first is, what specific analytic strategies were carried out with AI assistance? So for instance, summarizing coding, conversing with documents. Did a qualitative researcher use AI to generate preliminary codes or engage in some kind of analysis of textual data? And this, of course, really reflects a distinct epistemic stance, and one that recognizes that GenAI may not be aligned fully with all interpretive traditions within qualitative inquiry. So it's really inviting us to pause, think through the potential implications at the methods and methodological level. A second question: what activities were completed with AI and on which dates? And this may seem really obvious, but it's actually a question of accountability. So if a researcher used ChatGPT in January 2024 to summarize field notes, that version of the model has unique capacities and different training data than it would in January 2026. So documenting such details is really acknowledging that AI systems are not static. They're constantly evolving, and that evolution will certainly influence analytic decisions. The third question: how does AI use align with research methodologies that are being taken up? So if you're working with, as an example, constructivist grounded theory, how might an AI-generated summary fit within how you're making sense of the iterative cycles of coding, recoding, and memoing? Or if your project is drawing upon discursive psychology, what are the onto-epistemological implications of asking a model to help you make sense of recurring conversational patterns? Fourth, what prompts or techniques were used during the workflow? Prompts themselves are not neutral. That's an analytic move that you'd be making. So reporting them is really part of methodological transparency, similar to how you might in the past have reported a coding map or a thematic map, or reflexive notes. And then finally, how did existing qualitative methodologies or methods need to be adapted in an AI-assisted qualitative research workflow? So this question is one that invites us to think about the ways in which we might have adapted our analytic practices, or developed some kind of new way of documenting our decision-making. For instance, if you were conducting a narrative study, did you adapt the ways in which you thought about comparing and deconstructing the structure of a storytelling in ways that was unique to the tool that you were using? So when we talk about methods in the merit framework, we're really focusing on this idea of making your methodological and methods-based decisions visible, in a way in which how AI entered into the qualitative research process is clear to an outsider, the reasons that you adopted it, and what those consequences might have been for the methodological craft that you were engaging in.
Hi, this is Dana.
The next dimension is ethics. And here we really are putting forward the idea of a human-centered orientation to ethics. And when we're talking about ethics in the context of GenAI, I think it's really easy for us to just think about compliance. I think that's probably the easiest thing for us to do. So we think about, do I have ethics board approval? Did they sign off on this? Was my data private enough? But the questions that we're raising here are really aimed at this plus some other things. So the questions here are really asking us to consider who is being centered in the research process and whose interests are being served through the use of AI. So a first important question is who holds power and who benefits from this particular workflow? And this really gets at the socio-political economy of GenAI. So when we're using, for instance, commercial AI tools trained on massive data sets, what systems are we participating in? What are we complicit in? Who's benefiting, what corporations are benefiting. And there's really no escape for us on this. And so it is important that we not pretend that this is a question we can bypass. And instead, this really invites us to consider, does the use of AI reinforce or in some way potentially redistribute existing hierarchies of power that exist between researchers, participants, technologies, institutions, et cetera? Next, we encourage asking, how was equitable access to AI platforms ensured? And this has been an important question that we've long encouraged asking about digital tools in general within the qualitative research community. This really invites us to think about accessibility, digital privilege, affordability. If only well-resourced researchers or researchers working at universities that can afford to develop their own advanced AI tools are gaining access to such things, whose inquiries, whose practices might be backgrounded. So a human-centered ethics just really is inviting us to consider that participating in technologically mediated research really does become shaped by access. The third question, how was researcher competency established before using the AI tool, is really underscoring this idea that ethical use of GenAI begins with knowledgeable use. Just as we would expect a qualitative researcher to be trained and well-versed in the qualitative methodologies and perspectives that they're claiming to use, the same is true for AI tools. So this really means that it's important for us to pause and really assure that we understand how an AI system works, including its limitations, its potential harms, its biases. So this is the call to read deeply, engage in training, beyond training that simply teaches us the basics of a tool, so that we fully understand what it is that we're adopting. And then finally, a question that we encourage is, how was informed consent obtained from participants or communities regarding AI use? And this is really a crucial question, and one that we really can't talk ourselves out of, or perhaps we really shouldn't talk ourselves out of avoiding. Participants are going to consent to take part in a qualitative study, for instance, but have they consented to having, for instance, their words processed, summarized, uploaded, or transformed by a GenAI system? So ethical practice, as has long been written about in qualitative inquiry, really does require transparency, not just about what we're doing with data or what kind of data we're collecting, but also how technologies are mediating the ways in which we ultimately might represent participants' perspectives. Next. So the next dimension or category of the merit framework is responsibility. And here we're talking about responsible human oversight and accountability. The responsibility is really inviting us as qualitative inquirers to stay ever attentive to who is answerable for what happens when AI is adopted or taken up within a qualitative research workflow. So the first question, what are the potential consequences for both researchers and participants in AI-assisted workflows, is one that's really speaking to the risks of engaging, but also reminding us of the relational qualities of qualitative inquiry. So responsibility in this sense really involves tracing the consequences across analytic and ethical contexts. Second, how is human intellectual contribution distinguished from AI-generated output? This is crucial when writing or publishing. And qualitative inquiry interpretation is a human act, grounded in context, empathy, reflexivity. So these are all things that we're wanting to attend to as we think about how our processes might be transformed. And third, what role did AI play? Was it an assistant, a collaborator, or something else? Really making this transparent is important for others to be able to evaluate and make sense of the work and the ways in which technology mediated it. Fourth, was authorship limited to humans per journal guidelines? It is true that many journals and professional organizations prohibit listing AI tools as authors. And they do often, though, expect disclosure of AI involvement. So responsible reporting really does include stating whether AI was used and then how it was used. Fifth was human judgment, validation of AI outcomes, and accountability emphasized throughout the workflow. This means that every AI-assisted step really should be followed by a human engaging with it, a human qualitative inquirer. If AI, for instance, suggests categories or codes, the researcher is reviewing and revising them. And finally, what potential conflicts of interest need to be disclosed. So if researchers are affiliated with, funded by, or beta testing commercial AI platforms, this needs to be made transparent. Trena.
Okay, and I'll just also mention as we move into the next category that we aren't recommending that every single one of these questions need to be answered in every single report that you might make. Rather, they are questions that hopefully you are engaging in terms of the consequences, and the ones that really mattered to the outcome of your study, you would want to report that. And these are also in process, so we welcome feedback. You'll already see that they're slightly different from the book chapter that's coming out, because as we get feedback and we start to use these in our own work, they do change. So I is the impact on research outcomes. And the big one here is, how did you figure out that what AI told you is accurate? How are you going to validate the outputs in terms of hallucinations, which are really just errors, any dis or misinformation, or plagiarism checks that might be needed? So how do you detect any hallucinations or the biases that are underlying the language models that are used in the platform that you've adopted? How do you mitigate those? What are the trade-offs between speed and accuracy? As I mentioned before, a lot of the advertising and marketing around these tools are that they will let you do something you don't want to do anyway much faster. But is it also accurate? And what are the trade-offs when you go faster in terms of both accuracy and trust with your participants, and you also learning something as the researcher that when you hand it off, you will no longer be learning? How did AI outputs align with traditional trustworthiness criteria, such as credibility, dependability, or the ones that are specifically related to the methodology that you're using? And overall, did AI use improve or diminish the study quality, and how did you assess that? And finally, the tool, T is for tool transparency and the design implications for the tool. So it's been very interesting to watch the traditional quote unquote platforms, MaxQDA, NVivo, Atlas TI, and others adopt AI, and to see how transparently and in what ways they did so. So reflecting on and reporting on what type of AI platform, you would definitely want to report what you used. Was it a traditional tool? Was it just OpenAI? Are you just using ChatGPT? Are you using one of the new specialized tools like Q Insights or AILize? And why did you choose that tool? Was the AI platform open source, proprietary? Are they using a fairly trained model as opposed to ones that are using data that was scraped from the web? Are they able to limit the use of your protected data for training? Are you able to turn off that option that they're not using your research data to train the model? Can you document the session details, the model versions, and the processes that you used? Are you able to acknowledge the limitations and the biases of the models and the platforms that you chose, and how well does your platform guarantee data privacy, security, and participant protections. And Provalis Research recently posted a blog, did a post on their blog about data privacy claims that a lot of generative AI platforms are making that may or may not be accurate. So we'll post that in the blog, in the chat too, once we finish screen sharing. And then maybe most importantly, can you actually provide feedback to the developers? Historically, the qualitative data analysis software companies have been wonderful about actually listening to us as researchers, because most of them are also qualitative researchers, and adjusting their features based on what users need. And so noting that and making selections accordingly can be hugely helpful. So then just to wrap up before questions, I'll just run through some example reporting paragraphs just to give you an idea of what this might look like. And again, this may or may not work for every instance. I would say if you're writing a thesis or a dissertation, you actually have more room to engage in more significant and substantial reporting, and that provides a great model for the people who are coming after you. So in the methods section, and it was interesting as we were creating these paragraphs, we realized that they don't exactly come in the order of the merit framework, and that's fine. But, you know, so again, your mileage may vary in terms of how this actually looks in your work. But for example, we chose to use a traditional tool that now embeds AI into its platform. We chose MaxQDA over NVivo and ChatGPT due to its integration with existing coding structures, institutional licensing, and transparent data handling policies. We used MaxQDA version 24.2, specifically its AI Assist suite. And then we kind of explain here that they use LLMs from a third-party provider with the LLM noted on their website. We then explain that we logged all of the sessions, prompts, and summaries with timestamps and research memos. And we talk about the in-tool options for reporting issues or feedback to the developers. Our institution provided all researchers with licensed access to MaxQDA, removing financial barriers. And the PI completed 3 online training sessions and used the AI Assist tools in prior classroom settings. So again, which one of these would be most important to your study will be different, but this just examples of what might be important. And I will say too that this is especially important to report now, as we are all still in the early days, as some of these new innovations become normalized, and maybe they may not need to be as discussed as transparently, but I do think that right now they do need to be. Okay, Jessica?
So the next one really gets back to that issue around assuring that you attend to and report out the ways in which you went about disclosing your use of AI to your participants. So this example would be from potentially a method section around participant protections, where you might speak about the ways in which your consent forms stated that anonymized transcripts may be processed using AI-assisted tools for analytic purposes. All transcripts were fully de-identified before use. AI assist logs were stored securely, and no data was shared externally, which speaks to some of the privacy approaches that you might have taken, but most importantly, it tends to making explicit that you had consent from the participant.
Okay, then we get into methodological strategies. So for example, we adapted our DA approach by treating AI outputs as tentative interpretations to be examined and interrogated, not accepted, within the lens of language use and interactional meaning. And then we go through the actual process in terms of where we were doing things as humans, initially analyzing. Then we moved to MaxQDA AI Assist and why. Then we actually gave it a role. It's a secondary validation check, alerting the researchers to any additional interpretations or patterns that were not already identified. We include the time frame and exactly which specific MaxQDA tools we were using. And I do think this is extremely important right now, and we're starting to see more and more papers that are actually offering workflows and deep descriptions and reflections on this, which is great to see, and you can contribute to that body of work.
And as another example here, you might speak to the ways in which AI responses were used to surface alternative framings and interactional features aligned with discourse analysis, so naming directly the methodological engagement that you engaged. The second paragraph there points back to this idea that the prompts that you used aren't neutral, so sample prompts included what interactional stance does the speaker take, or are there any transcripts that seem to be outliers very significantly from the other transcripts in terms of interactional stance? So again, making that explicit to a reader. AI outputs were used to test and contrast interpretation. So this is an example of actually making explicit how you use the AI outputs as an inquirer. This aligns with triangulation practices, so linking what it is that you were doing with the actual methodological practice here. The AI output was reviewed by human researchers who had already conducted multiple readings and a preliminary analysis of the data, et cetera. So again, making explicit that the human researcher was remaining an integral part of the interpretive process.
And then finally, with the concluding section, mentioning that, for example, if we were trying to publish this in the journal Social Science and Medicine, we would acknowledge that we followed their policy, we disclosed the use, and that we're referencing the limitations and biases of the model, and then actually noting what it was that we found as maybe problematic, what it can't do. Showing that it's only ever going to be an interpretive partner, and that only the researchers, human researchers, are the authors, and then the risks that we encountered and what we acknowledged too, that we could become over-reliant on AI discoveries, and that the participants' perspectives could well be flattened by algorithmic summarization. No summaries are neutral, and so acknowledging that is key, and then talking about the author's background and conflict of interest. So hopefully that was helpful. These are some of the, again, and we look forward to conversing about this. We will also put the link in the chat. I've been trying to keep a updated list of all of the publications that have been coming out about qualitative research and AI. It's growing all the time, but these are some of our chapters that are coming out next year, as well as some of the ones that we talked about today. So I will go ahead and stop screen sharing, and we welcome your thoughts.
Thank you so very much to both of you, Jessica and Trena, for your presentation. Lots to think about there, and lots of thanks in the chat as well. I like the way that you grounded your merit framework in a little bit of historical context in terms of how we kind of got here, with the respect to the use of digital AI, digital tools more generally, and also in terms of the kind of broader research integrity space. So thank you very much for that. I also thought it was really interesting how you talk about the merit framework and the guidelines as evolving as you use them yourselves and gain feedback from others, and that made me think of them sort of as living guidelines, as it were, you know, which seems to fit really nicely, doesn't it, and reflect the nature of the space right now and what's going on as developers as well as methodologists and researchers kind of grapple with what's going on. So I really enjoyed those parts of your presentation myself. In the chat, there's a few questions, but first of all, a few thanks. So somebody mentioned how thought-provoking your insights were in terms of developing reflexivity practice when using Cactus. And there was a comment about appreciating how you respond to limitations or constructive criticisms that come your way, and that was a courageous thing to do, but a really great thing. So just in case you missed those. So lots of questions in the chat and lots in my head also, but let's start off with a little bit about historical and future developments, because I think there's a few around that. So somebody asked the question about how long AI has been used in this space and whether it's kind of recent adoption. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that in terms of the technology itself, and then also how you became engaged with the use of AI in Qual?
Well, so OpenAI was released in what I feel like we all have this date burned in our brain in November of 2022. And I think what's been most shocking for those of us who have been in this space for a long time is how quickly the software developers integrated into their platforms, and how quickly people who, as Christina, you have said before, how quickly people who had no interest in qualitative research suddenly became experts on qualitative research in the age of AI. So it happened very quickly, quite head spinning. Especially for me in academia, where things happen over hundreds of years. So it's been quite a abrupt uptake by our students and our collaborators, and that's what forced us, whether we liked it or not, to figure out what has been going on and come up with some way to make sense of it. So yeah, it's all happened really fast. I mean, it has been 3 years now, but it doesn't feel like it's that long because things keep changing so much and so quickly. Jessica, I don't know if you want to add something to that. That's my perspective on it.
No, I mean, I think that's spot on. I think that, like so many things, in this particular sociopolitical, it's been a dizzying speed, which I think goes back to the idea of what might be lost if we don't take up a slow ontology approach as qualitative inquirers. That's actually pretty foundational to some of the ways we think about interpretation. And I think it's important not to think about slowness as time, like that's too simplistic, but actually an interpretive practice of, if we adopt things so quickly without attending to the consequences and just fall into the trap of technological progress means methodological progress, I do wonder what we'll be left with 10 years down the road.
And that's a lot to do with the hype, isn't it? So I was also thinking, given, so you mentioned quite a few other methodologists as well as yourselves in terms of the concerns that many of us have about this. But at the same time, lots and lots of people are using it, and everybody seems to want to use it. The number of people who come to sessions like this, for example, and why that is, and how that relates to the sort of more general hype in the world around AI. Because I reflect a lot. I don't know what you think about this. On this is the first time that a technology that could be and is being used for qualitative analysis actually infiltrates all of our lives in all kinds of other spaces as well, and that's very different from how that's happened before. I wonder if you have any reflections on whether that's partly to do with the hype and this sense that we need to adopt these technologies just because they're there rather than because they're actually helpful.
Well, in American culture, we always believe that any new technology must be good, right? Like, we're very much a tech optimist culture. So there's a lot of trust and faith in places that honestly, by now, we should know better than to have trust and faith in, but it's very shiny. I don't actually, it's funny, I don't use it at all. I never even think to use ChatGPT for anything on a daily basis. So I think that does make me a little bit of an outlier. But yes, it's everywhere. It's pervasive. There's an incredible pressure of FOMO, fear of missing out, panic. And so I love that Jessica really emphasized that let's just slow down and take a beat. And I think if you can just keep two things in mind, qualitative research is not a problem to be solved. As Janet Sammons has said, if you don't like this kind of work, guess what? You don't have to do it. Nobody is forcing you to do qualitative research. It's not a problem to be solved. So I mean, that's, I think, really important. And there is a lot of potential harm that is coming from this entire AI push. And I'll try not to get too political, but there's a big agenda, and people are benefiting from this that has nothing to do with us, our daily lives, and certainly nothing to do with qualitative research. So I think really understanding, and that's where Emily Bender and Alex Hanna's book on the AI con can be just to understand what is the motivation behind this push to make us all adopt it, whether we want it or not.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll also just add, I think one of the things that is shaping and speeding up within the qualitative research community and adoption of AI is the notion of efficiency and the idea that something will happen more efficient in our research, which I just think falls into the trap of the neoliberal research enterprise that many of us are a part of thinking that something done faster is better. And again, that's not a core foundational commitment within qualitative inquiry. We have never maintained that as a value. Like, our goal is to do fast research. Our goal is to do thoughtful, rigorous, interpretive research. And there's no need for us to unsettle the foundations of qualitative inquiry and add in a new value called efficiency. That's just kind of complying with this idea that technological progress is what should shape our methodological decisions.
And so would you say that the same thing in terms of more data as well? Because it's not just quicker and efficient, there's also the discourse around, oh, we can handle more data using AI as well.
I would say the same thing. Like, why?
Yeah.
Why do we need that? More is not better. I mean, we know, thinking back to foundational, I think it's really important to turn back to foundational commitments of qualitative inquiry. And we know an N of 1 has always been positioned as significant, for good reason. We can go back and like unpack the philosophical commitments of that and what underlies the methodological practices that undergird that. Though I, again, just think it's falling into a seductive trap.
And this really became an issue with social media data. So the thing is that, once there's actually the availability to work with large data sets, and there becomes such large text availability on the internet, there's this idea that we have to. So the thing is, and this really just goes back to, what methodology are you using? Computational methods of text analysis and natural, though, that is not qualitative research per se. There's data analytics. There are other ways to make sense of huge amounts of data. What are you trying to do? Is it a mixed method study to really understand a particular case, what is the boundary of what you're trying to do? Again, we can't separate this, and we didn't talk about it a lot in this presentation, but we have in other ones, that first you have to figure out what kind of research design you're even doing before you can even answer any of these questions. And some designs might require more data than others, but qualitative researchers aren't typically dealing with thousands of data points. It's not qualitative research anymore. I mean, we're about depth over breadth historically. So again, taking a step back to figure out what is it you're actually trying to do, and not get so excited by the fact that you could acquire all of this data, which just ends up leading to more problems and taking you away from your purpose.
So that makes me think about sectors in which qual happens, because of course it's not only academia, but also the analytic methods that we use. So I was interested in your talking about qualitative workflows and the different stages at which researchers may think about using generative AI. So interested in hearing a little bit more maybe on whether there's certain stages where you think it may be more appropriate or less appropriate, but also in terms of certain methods. So what are your thoughts on, whether GenAI for discourse analysis is more appropriate than for thematic analysis, or whatever it might be?
Jessica, I know why don't you go ahead on this one, because I know that you've thought a lot about why you don't use it for the types of work that you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my work is all within the realm of SI methodology and conversation analysis, and some forms of discourse analysis as well. So I think what's been heralded as the utility of AI in qualitative inquiry has been the idea of summarizing and some degree of coding. And I know there's lots of buzz around, like, do we even need humans to do thematic analysis, because now it can do it for us. And so in my own work, I'm particularly interested in recurring interactional practices as located within the context of an interactional sequence, and don't find it particularly useful for someone to summarize for me what a text shows. Analytically, it's epistemically misaligned. And then I'll also say I work with health protected data. So there is no world in which my health security ethical requirements will ever allow me to use AI with my data, for good reason. And that includes university-built resources where the data is housed within it, because of potential health privacy violations. So those two reasons are really driving for me. And I'll just be honest and say, I don't I wasn't having a problem with my analytic practices. So I don't know what it solves for me. And that's really the core of it. Things are going really well analytically. I'm at the speed of producing work that is what I need to be at. The stakeholders that are interested, I meet those deadlines. I don't need more efficiency. And analytically, I'm well aligned with the methodological underpinnings. So for me, it's really a question of why, and what is it that it would afford me is pretty bounded to practices that aren't very well aligned with the analytic practices that I engage in conversation analytic and discourse analytic work. Trena.
I was just answering one of the questions in the chat. So we were talking about which types of work is it more or less useful for? I mean, I think that's something that I'm kind of figuring out right now. Somebody asked about from our experience so far, how close to a human interpretive partner was AI. I mean, I will say there's definitely, you cannot hand this stuff over. It's interesting comparing, for example, the AI coding assist feature in MaxQDA and seeing how it diverges so much from how you might as a human. But then you see some of the tailwind or the AI summarization tools that you're not seeing the behind the scenes, you're just seeing the big picture and realizing, oh, it may not be that accurate, even though it looks cleaner, because I can see the discrepancy in the AI assist coding and how it's a slightly different. So, I mean, I just think it's still early days, and I think that I work across a lot of different methodologies on a lot of different research teams, and what I've been doing mostly is helping them think through this. So the process is also all slightly different, and I don't have a good answer to that question yet, because I think I'm still trying to figure out, like, it's definitely not doing it. It's not doing it in a way that replaces how we have to interpret it. It just creates more work, to be honest. Like, it's like it's like doing everything that you do with a research assistant who is still learning. And sometimes I don't need to take, I mean, that takes a lot of time. I like to just know how to do it with other people who already know how to do it. I don't want to always be training new people how to do it, which is how I feel about it a lot of times. Yeah, and I know we sound very negative because a lot of the chat comments are like, but. So I do think that part of our reason for offering these guidelines is because we know that people are going to have to use it. So trying to get ahead of that, here are some questions to think about and report about your use so that all of us who have experience can lead the way. Here is what to tell other people about what you're doing and why, to make us all better researchers, knowing that we're often going to be talking to people who have no training in qualitative methods. They're just going to the AI tools. So hopefully this helps us all as a community put those questions and guardrails out there for each other.
And so that brings in the piece about teaching as well. I know that you both teach methods or have taught qual methods as well. And so any reflections you have about, you just mentioned, Trena, that, it sometimes feels like there's more work when you're using AI. Do you feel the same in terms of the teaching of methods? Because I've always, as you know, I've always been really frustrated that there's not enough teaching of tools along with methods. And I think that you can teach methods via tools. And I just wonder how you're feeling about this added layer of AI that comes into that, because I don't think we can talk about methods without talking about AI anymore. At least I don't think that that's really a responsible thing to do for the coming generations. I just wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
Christina, do you have a webinar planned yet for how people are teaching qual methods
in
with
my mind,
AI?
But not in reality?
Because that is almost like a whole other topic. Yeah, I now have to, because I teach qualitative research with technology, AI is in every module now. It's every week where and that I didn't ask to have to redesign my entire curriculum, but here we are. And I am grateful for the opportunity to get ahead of it with these students so they can think about what's the difference with by hand, just MaxQDA, the AI assist features with MaxQDA, and ChatGPT, and what are the problems with turning your data over to a platform that has no guardrails, no privacy with your data, no agreement from participants that you're going to be putting it out in the world. Yeah, so Jessica, how about you?
Yeah, so So I teach like intro to qualitative research methods courses, as well as more advanced courses like conversation analysis, ethnomethodology, discursive psychology. So a couple of things, and just looking through the chat, yes, I mean, of course, we know that AI is integrated into our lives, and certainly our students often come knowing more about AI than they do qualitative inquiry. But I will say that I think it's important not to make that assumption, that our students are coming into our classroom with the assumption that you're there to teach them how to do conversation analysis via AI. I haven't actually had that experience. Actually, I've had the experience where students are there to learn the methodological foundations of conversation analysis, as an example, historically across time, and then engage in a critical appraisal of where might the integration of various digital technologies shape the way that I think about my workflow for conversation analytics study, be it AI or something else. So for instance, a big question for a lot of folks is, should they use automated transcription when they're engaging with a conversation analytics study? And for some, there's good methodologically driven reasons that that particular kind of software is really useful. But to get at those reasons, I would argue that you have to be thinking in parallel, kind of like what Christina said, is we can't just be thinking with tools. We have to be thinking with methodological underpinnings that will shape the use of those tools, because it's all entangled. And so in my courses, I don't have like an AI policy that says you can't. My AI policy on my syllabus is that you have a rationale that's methodologically grounded and you tell me what it is. And you don't just tell me what it is at the end, like that we engage in thinking with technological reflexivity and we really think through potential consequences of use or not use, because consequences are both good and bad. So I will say that I think this is an evolving area for qualitative pedagogy. I think it's really important that we don't assume that any of us have figured this out, and that it will be something that will emerge across time. But what I hope we do is that we don't just walk in and assume that that's what we need to do, is invite everyone to use AI for everything, including generation of fake data. I mean, that's something that we need to be thoughtful about as well, is where is AI use disallowed in teaching a methods course and why?
Yeah, and I think that's why your sort of general discussion about methodological reflexivity is so important, because the merit framework that you've presented with us today is just one part of the sort of general, we should be thinking about what we're doing and why we're doing it and what the consequences, positive and maybe not so, as you just said, Jessica. I mean, that's part of what doing research is anyway, outside of, you know, digital tools or AI or anything else. So for me, you know, notwithstanding some of the concerns, I'm also seeing it as an opportunity to have those conversations again. And so that's why a lot of what you're doing with the merit framework, I think, allows us to step back and encourage ourselves, but also our students and our colleagues, and in our writings, to actually think about, well, you know, what is it that we're doing and why are we doing it? And I think that's actually, you know, that's a great thing, isn't it? And sort of seeing the opportunity of a new technology as being able to do that. So many other things I want to tap into, but I just wanted to say something about the actual merit framework itself. So when you were showing the examples of the paragraphs that you might write around certain things towards the end, for example, you know, which tools you use at which stages, and documenting all of that process, it just struck me that you know, many people might say, oh, that seems like a lot of work. I've got to document all of these different stages I've done, and how that affects the way that we might see writings in the future. So just thinking, you know, you said earlier about how researchers haven't always been very good at documenting their process anyway, and so now with this new layer of potential AI use, we're suggesting that they need to document that in even more detail? And is, you know, to what extent is that realistic in all situations, and what can we do to ensure that that happens? I'm just thinking about the kind of mismatch between the way you might document something and what actually happens in reality. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on like who your audience is for the documentation for sure. I mean, you know, the biggest pushback I've always gotten around this is that, well, there's just not enough space in journal articles, and that it could be true, and that's why I do think that students who are writing their dissertation, their thesis, actually have more space to provide guidance for future students because they can put it in the longer documents, or in a methodological appendix or something like that. I think at minimum, you want to have all of that documented before the peer review process comes around, because the peer reviewers might ask you these things, even if it doesn't end up being in the final, like at least just a few sentences. I think having research journaling and keeping memos is such an important part of the process that you're going to want to have that all tracked anyway, like you would your entire data analysis, data collection analysis process. It should just go right alongside that. It's not new. I would say, and I guess, the concern is always that as soon as you don't document or acknowledge that you're using it, it becomes normalized, accepted, and opaque, as if, well, of course you're doing these things. And I don't think that's a great way to move forward. It wasn't with QDA software tools back in the day, because it perpetuates a lot of misconceptions that the tool is doing the analysis if you don't make clear that it's the human that's doing the analysis assisted with the tools. And that's always been like this tension. But I agree, the way that looks might be different for everybody. And also, you don't have to use any of these, really. If you just want to, focus on the way you've always done it and just be more clear, that's okay too. Jessica, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think in part, if you're thinking about one audience being a journal, I think in part, I don't think we quite yet know whether there are confines to our reporting, because a lot of journals are catching up with the realities of what this means. I feel that it's likely going to be increasingly common for journals to ask for supplementary materials that document in depth the ways in which we're engaging with tools. And I'm going to put in the chat an example from a recent publication in the Qualitative Health Research Journal, where you'll see extensive supplementary material for how the researchers use a large language model to test out some reflexive thematic analysis. And I think it's a really good example of, if we're going to do these things, then it's important that we are transparent about these things and not forget the lessons we've already learned within the landscape of qualitative research, which is that there's no reason that we have to be opaque with our processes. And in fact, that only supports us in confirming and further explicating the rigor and the validity of the claims that we're making if we can be transparent. So I think we have like a small number of examples that are starting to come out that are showing us what this might look like. And it is going to involve publishing outlets really coming up to speed. And I think that will happen with some time.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I can't believe it, but we've run out of our time, even though we had more time than normal. We could carry on talking about these things for a long time, and I think you can probably see, if you're able to look in the chat, how useful people have found your presentation and the discussion. So thank you both very, very much. I'll just wrap up. There was one question about whether you were able to share your slides. I don't know if that's something that you can do. You don't need to do it now, but maybe we can send them along if you're happy to with the recording. And we'll also send along with that the reference to the forthcoming chapter as well, so that people get that along with the recording. But I will leave it there for now. There are no more Cactus webinars scheduled yet, but we've got lots of ideas in our minds. And as mentioned previously, we are very keen to hear from you all what you would like us to arrange webinars on, and also if you want to present your own thoughts on any aspect of using software for qualitative analysis. Doesn't have to be AI. can be non-AI. That's also really something we're very interested in. So I've just put the link in the chat for those of you that are still here. If you want to suggest ideas or propose something yourself, then please do that. But for now, I will thank both Professors Lester and Paulus again very much for spending the time sharing your very deep and methodologically useful thoughts with us about what's going on, and thank everybody else for coming along too, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christina.